Hello there from the position of the worst job in America, presidential debate moderator. We have a world of people, a nation of people who don't value argument, don't value debate, and have never really been taught how to do it. We have candidates who don't respect each other or respect people who think on the opposite side. And then we have a commission setting up the debates that have no concept of what debate is. I mean, many of you wrote about this in your last paper, which is great because here in unit, I think it's unit 4 that we're in now, we're looking at different conceptions of argumentation. A lot of you wrote about in your last paper about how you would want some rules, and a lot of you wrote about the first presidential debate of 2020, how terrible it was. It wasn't even really a debate, was it? Just kind of like old guys yell at each other, and somebody tries to maintain order, but they don't respect him either. So I'm sitting here in the position of the most useless person in the United States right now, the debate moderator. So this is this video is going to be about one of the more confusing readings that we're going to do the term, which is the Pragma-dialectical discussion model. This essay by Van Imeren and Grutendorst, who Frans van Imeren is one of the founders of what's called the Dutch School of Argumentation, which is Pragmadialectical Theory, which is the idea that dialectic exchanging words with each other, that process, which we read about in Chris Tyndale's book. Remember, he says that argumentation is logical, dialectical, rhetorical, and he's starting with rhetoric and moving back through the other ones to say you can form a rhetorical argumentation theory purely out of that, and that's his model. Van Imeren and the Dutch, the University of Amsterdam scholars, want to do it through dialectic, but not dialectic the way it's been considered philosophically. Like if you go to your philosophy class, any core philosophy class here at St. John's, and you ask your professor, what's dialectics? You're going to get this very kind of esoteric kind of answer because it's more of a model than it is a thing you can actually do. It's more of a what we call an ideal. And we'll get more into that in the course of this lecture about philosophical ideals and what they mean. But the purpose of this is just to take you through this article and kind of explain what I think a more regular sort of conversation about the rules of pragmadialectics are. Pragmadialectics is the theory that through dialectics you can have a really good argumentation model that would be ethical and good, and you could make progress there. But if you're trying to solve a difference of opinion, not necessarily trying to mass convince an entire group of people, not necessarily that, although it can be applied to that. But the critical discussion model is basically their rules for how you would argue with somebody, in a group or on the internet, face-to-face, maybe even through email exchange, maybe through letters if you wanted to do it that way. These are the rules that they would enforce. Now, the dialectic part we just covered. Now, what about the pragma part? What is that? Well, that comes from pragmatics, which means it needs to be something sourced from what's around us, something that we could do, something that we can actually has a connected politics to it, little p politics, like human action, the ability of what to do. So little p politics, not politics like Democrat, Republican, or whatever the parties are, wherever you're from. More of like politics is what are the human actions that are on the table, what's possible. That's kind of what they're going for. So they want the dialectic theory, but they're not making a theoretical argument. They're making a pragmatic argument. Here's how you do it. So pragma-dialectical. Here's how you argue with other people in a way that is philosophically rigorous and ethical, and also it's doable. It's something you can actually do. So let us tackle it by thinking about some initial questions. Now, some of you, when you're thinking about your argumentation theory that you're going to do for this class for the final exam, you might be thinking, oh man, I hope I turned Spotify off. You're going to be thinking, well, maybe I should just make some rules, and that's what argumentation should be. There should be some rules about it. Well, this is the essay for you. This essay is all about rules of arguing and how it should be done. They're making a prescriptive argument of how to know that argumentation was done correctly. So this is the article for you. So let's look to a couple of questions here. First, this is the wrong window. What happened to the window I had up here a second ago? This always happens to me. Oh, I'm going to have to go move it. Right? This is the syllabus, obviously. There we go. That's what we want on the screen. I leave all these technical errors in here. Why? Why do I do that? I think it's to show that we're all kind of learning this whole new setup, and I'm in the same boat you guys are. But the goal is communication and relationship. And let me take a little sidebar here to say that when you do a video presentation, you want it to be accessible. You want it to be human-oriented. You don't want it to be robotic. You don't want it to be descriptive, like you're telling us about your presentation. You want it to be something people make a connection. Communication is about relationships. So part of that is sort of exposing that we're all sort of struggling our way through this, even at this late state. Like I've been doing online teaching for a long time, and I still make little blunders like that, but it doesn't destroy the quality of what we're doing. So think about that when you do video presentations for assignments. You want them to be accessible. You want them to be thoughtful. You want them to be like a conversation, which is the way I'm doing these lectures. Okay, so what rules would you want enforced for an argument? That's the first question I have up here. This is kind of an interesting question to think about because we all said about the first debate that we wanted rules, but I bet if we were to have a conversation on Discord about this, we'd all come up with very different rules that we think would be good for arguments. So what are the rules that should be enforced? Well, maybe things like turn taking, not talking over people, directly answering questions, maybe. It really depends on what you want, but those are some of the ones that you hear in the national media about the presidential debates and what's wrong with them. So this article is going to this essay is going to try to argue that there are set rules that are almost absolutely virtually universal for any argument you get into. It's kind of interesting. And the second one is, what's the point of arguing? What should we get? When you argue with somebody, what's the point of that? Are you trying to be right? Are you trying to prove them wrong? Those are different things, by the way. Are you trying to explore an issue? Are you trying to just represent your side the best and you might not really believe what you're saying? Like if you're a diehard fan of a particular sports team, are you like just repping out your team by arguing that your running back is the best even though you know that they're not that good? There's so many things going on, but for this article, the point of arguing for them, the point of arguing is to solve a difference of opinion. That is, who's right? And that is one of the more traditional modes of argumentation is if we have a difference of opinion about something, how do we fix it? How do we solve it? How do we know who's got the correct opinion? The opinion that would be the one that we'd all believe in. And we use the word opinion because opinions have great weight. Now you consider the election, consider voting. In your opinion, who's the better president? Now, there's no fact that can solve that, but you can use facts to marshal that defense. So think about it like that. Opinions are not weak. They're very strong things, and democracies rely on opinions in order to function correctly. So opinions really matter quite a bit. Your opinion that you like, you'll probably call a fact because that's what people do. Like, well, I'm not speaking opinion, I'm looking to the facts, and the facts say, well, that's how you've constructed your opinion. But let's not discount opinions. Let's not say that they're not worth anything just because we have been taught in school that there are facts and opinions and facts are superior. Every teacher who teaches that is doing democracy a huge disservice. Why? Democracy runs on the expression of opinion about what should be done, what should we be doing, what should we stop. And that's where this Pragmadialectic thing comes in. And here's a model of how to do that. Okay, so let's go into it. And what I'm going to do for the rest of the talk is just go through the different rules and kind of explain them in my own kind of phrasing. And if you have, if you're an expert in Pragmadialectics or you know something about it, please comment on this video, comment on the blog, and let me know where I went wrong, because this is a very difficult thing to master. You can do a 2-3 year degree in Amsterdam on argumentation, on the critical discussion model, on Pragmadialectics. And they're excellent teachers and they really believe in their theory. I'm a rhetorician, American rhetorician. I'm not 100% convinced that this theory is the way to go. I might do another video about that later, but this video is just to get you to understand the article. And the reason why the article is assigned is to see what a rules-based approach looks like from a rigorous philosophical point of view that also wants to make a politics accessible, something you can do with it, instead of just saying, well, here's a philosophical truth, take it or leave it, which lots of philosophy essays are like. This one's like, no, this is how you can actually do this with your friends and achieve a level of philosophical rigor and a level of ethics in argumentation that is appropriate. That would be appropriate for society and for the good, really. I think I might be too loud. There we go. That's a little bit better. Hope you guys can still hear me okay. So yeah, let's get into it. Okay. I'm going to go down each one of these, and then I'm going to say what I think. So you can read all of this, but I'm just going to go over the rules and kind of explain what they mean. Okay, rule 1. Here it is. Blam. Let's make it nice and big so you can see it. How's that? Oh, beautiful. Okay, rule 1. Very wordy, isn't it? All these rules are kind of wordy, but remember, they're trying to be philosophically rigorous and maintain fidelity to the principles of dialectic, of philosophical dialectic, and make it practically useful. So there's a lot of caveats in the paragraphs after it. So rule 1, special conditions apply neither to the propositional content of the assertives by which a standpoint is expressed, nor to the propositional content of the negation of the commissive by means of which a standpoint is called into question. I swear this is the English one, not the Dutch one. All right, well, anyway. In the performance of these assertives and negative commissives, no special preparatory conditions apply to the position or status of the speaker or writer or listener or reader. Okay, what does this mean? Here's how I have it. Rule 1, how do we get into a critical discussion? Well, what happens is people put forward their ideas, and everyone has a right to put forward their ideas, and whatever the group wants to deal with, they're going to deal with by starting to call for externalized support. That is, beyond your opinion, what do you have to go on? Kind of like the Toolman question, what do you have to go on? And how does that connect? And that's kind of how you know which thing is going to be brought forward as the actual topic for the critical discussion. So one of the things about dialectic is you want to make sure you're focused. Remember Socrates in the dialogues, the Platonic dialogues? He's like, let's not go off track. Let's directly ask and answer questions about this one topic. And once we get that down, then we'll be better positioned to move forward to the other topic. That's kind of what they're saying here is everyone has a right to put forward an opinion and everyone has a right to question it. And as the group gets together, then we're going to have the critical discussion. You can move into a more formalization of the rules once people say, ooh, interesting standpoint. And of course, there's no rule that a standpoint you just debated about couldn't be brought up again and say, well, let's do it again. I don't know why you would. Most people are kind of tired of something after they've argued it with their friends for a little bit, but it could come back up tomorrow. And then you would still, people would have the right to say, no, let's not argue that. I want to talk about this. And then that might reach that level. But the thing is, nobody can dictate we're only talking about this. It comes naturally out of the crew, and naturally people will lean towards one that seems to be controversial and start to develop that into a critical discussion. Okay. Rule 2. The discussant that is called the standpoint of the other discussant in a question in the confrontation stage is always entitled to challenge this discussant to defend his or her standpoint. Okay, so what does this mean? If someone puts forward a position, everyone has the right to challenge them, ask them to defend it, but the person who says, hey, this is something you really need to back up, I want to hear from you why you think this is right, that's kind of the marker that this person needs to defend it. They're not obligated to defend it, but this is the confrontation stage, which means I want to hear more about that. So you have an unconditional right to ask anybody who puts forward an opinion, why do you think the way you do? Sounds like a pretty good rule. Why do you support that? And if you've put forward an opinion and you feel strongly about it, you're somewhat obligated to offer that defense. You don't have to. You can withdraw and say, well, I'm not very serious about that. You can do that if you want. Okay, so rule 3. The discussant who is challenged... I kind of got ahead of myself, sorry. The discussant who is challenged by the other discussant to defend the standpoint that he or she has put forward in the confrontation stage is always obliged to accept this challenge unless the other discussant is not prepared to accept certain shared premises and discussion rules. The discussant remains obliged to defend the standpoint as long as he or she does not retract it and as long as he or she has not successfully defended it against the other discussant on the basis of the agreed premises and discussion rules. Okay, that's like a mouthful, but it says you're always obliged to defend your opinion when someone challenges it because it's your opinion. You believe it and you think it's right. But if the other discussant is doesn't accept your terminology, the premises of it, like what you mean by freedom, what you mean by taxes, what you mean by the military, things like that, like all these things have to kind of be sorted out by the people participating. If you successfully defend it against another challenge, you might not have to defend it again. You can say, well, didn't you hear the discussion I just had with James over here? Did you hear the discussion I had with Barbara or whoever, right? So they can always refer to that. But you're always kind of obligated to defend your opinion, is what they're saying. I wonder if you'll agree with that. I kind of feel like if you put forward an opinion, you say, this is what's right, and someone says, well, why do you think that way? I want to hear more about that. Or I think you're wrong. You need to prove that to me. You can't just say something like, well, we just agree to disagree, or everyone has a right to an opinion. That's not proper in critical discussion. And I wonder what you'll think of that interpretation of it, is that they do not like the idea that people can say, let's just agree to disagree, or that people can say, well, everyone has a right to an opinion. Can you do that under this? No, you'd have to say, well, it's not a serious opinion. I'm not saying you should change your mind. You have to kind of back down once you're challenged, and people can still kind of come after you. But if you walk away, if you don't want to talk about it, well, it's not going to happen, obviously. Kind of an interesting rule. So this is also the rule where you establish burden of proof, and burden of proof is a concept that is talked about a lot in argumentation and debate. Burden of proof is who has the burden to provide the greater weight of evidence, the evidence that would support their side. Normally, this is conceived of that the person who's trying to get someone to change their mind has the burden of proof. So in a court of law, the prosecutor has the burden of proof. The defense attorney in a criminal case does not have to prove their client innocent. They just have to prove that there is a reasonable doubt that that person committed the crime, that the case is not strong enough to warrant a conviction. Likewise, in civil court, the plaintiff has the burden of preponderance of evidence. All the defense has to do is show the evidence is not enough or not warranted enough, either by propositional content or by force that's not powerful enough to warrant a judgment for the plaintiff. But that burden of proof is a little easier to do because you can always produce lots and lots of evidence to where it has this kind of snowball effect to where you look at all this and you say, well, it has to be, they have the greater weight of evidence. You sit there and question it all day, but you don't have any of your own. They have the greater weight. But in criminal court, if you don't have to prove yourself innocent. That's why you don't have to take the stand and testify on your behalf. Your attorney can just cause enough doubt in the jury or in the judge to show that a reasonable doubt is warranted, that the prosecution's case is not strong enough, even though it has enough evidence to indict, which is a grand jury question. So yeah, burden of proof. Who has the burden of proof in critical dialectics, in critical discussion, in pragmadialectics? Whoever puts the standpoint out there and doesn't retract it, the one that's being questioned. And you've been in situations like this with your friends before, right? You've been in these situations where I forgot to turn my phone off again. You've been in these situations where everyone's questioning, so yeah, why do you think that? Why? And they're like, okay, let me defend myself. Then they kind of give a short speech. You're in a critical discussion, according to the Pragmadialecticians, right? So that's how burden of proof. If you put out a proposition and it's your opinion and you're like, this is what I believe, and you don't take it back, you have the obligation to prove it. You can't just go, you haven't disproven it. You have to prove it, right? That's the rule. Okay. So let's go on to rule 4. Rule 4. The discussant that in the opening stage has accepted the other discussant's challenge to defend his or her standpoint is like, yeah, I'll back myself up. Yeah. Will fulfill the role of the protagonist in the argumentation stage, and the other discussant will fulfill the role of antagonist unless they agree otherwise. So they could flip it if they wanted to. I'll talk about that in a minute. The distribution of roles is maintained until the end of the discussion, until they call it quits and say, okay, we're done talking about this. Then the process would start over. So the protagonist is the person who is defending a position, and the antagonist is challenging the position. That's confusing because in the American tradition of debate, this is written by people who grew up in the Netherlands and they live in Dutch culture. But in the United States, we always think of the argument as antagonistic. That if someone's arguing with you, they're being the antagonist. They're antagonizing you, right? They're pushing you. So don't get confused by the terminology. The person who is the antagonist in the Dutch theory is the person who's defending the status quo or saying, I don't really feel like I agree with you. I need more evidence, or I think my beliefs are fine the way they are. And the protagonist is saying, no, you need to change your mind. You need to do this. You need to stop doing that. They're the ones advocating for change. So keep that straight. That can be kind of confusing. Also, in a discussion, in this section, I would pay careful attention to the Rule 4 discussion, because this part here, agreements concerning the discussion rules, very cool. They say there are a lot of rules about how a discussion should proceed that are immediate, that are contextual, that are cultural, that are just for that group. And the group needs to have a conversation about what counts as evidence, what counts as a good argument, Well, I mean, not a good argument, but what counts as evidence? What counts as appropriate external sources? What's going to back it up? And those conventions are very important. Especially when people say, hey, is this the way we should be talking to each other? We're all friends. So things about style and appropriateness are really important here too. And if that happens in the middle of the debate, it's called a meta discussion of the, and a discussion is what we have about the rules of how we're going to do a critical discussion. So we're always having this kind of what counts as conventions of it, right? So if you have explicitly agreed rules, you can talk about force of a rule, an application of a rule, about what's permitted and what's not. It might be that everyone agrees that, let's say you're having a political debate and everyone agrees CNN is garbage, or Fox News is garbage, or MSNBC is garbage. So they make an agreement that those sources cannot be brought in to defend an argument. If someone brings those in, they're in violation of the rule. That might end the critical discussion. That might be over at that point, depending on what people think how flagrant the violation of the rules are. I mean, obviously there are cultural rules about this kind of thing, about lying, misrepresenting statistics knowingly, or arguing in bad faith, just arguing to be a troll or an edgelord. People have rules like this in their friend groups already. This is what they're referring to. Okay, rule 5. Got to pick up the pace here. I don't want this to be too long because the article's long and complicated and I want you to read it. This is really just a guide. Can I take another sidebar to say I don't really want you guys citing or quoting these videos in the assignments. I'd rather you quote the paper and give your view. I want your view, not mine. I already know my view. I'm here as kind of a facilitator and a guide. I don't want you, it's like I took you out into the mountains and you sketched me. No, I want you to sketch the mountain. I took you out into a beautiful field of flowers and I said, paint this. And you paint me kind of like staring at the flowers. It's kind of weird, right? Don't bring these videos into it. Read the article. Read as much of it as you can. And if you don't understand a part, make that part of your presentation or your essay. Talk about why you don't understand it, what you think it means. You're probably going to be right. This stuff appears very complex, but it's not. It's only written this way to meet exactly what they said in Rule 4, the conditions of what good style is, the conditions of what appropriate argument is. That's all they're doing. That's all they're doing. And you do the same thing when you talk with your friends. You do. It's true. All right. Rule 5. The discussants who fulfill... We haven't done this yet, right? Okay. The discussants who fulfill the roles of protagonist and antagonist in the argumentation stage agree before the start of the argumentation stage on the rules for the following: how the protagonist is to defend the initial standpoint and how the antagonist is to attack this standpoint. In which case the protagonist has successfully defended the standpoint, in which case the antagonist has successfully attacked it. The rules in which this is laid down apply throughout the duration of the discussion and may not be called into question during the discussion itself by either party. So this is the rules about how things are going to be defended and attacked. I have a great example of this. There's a video actually, I think on my channel, of a debate about doing fair trade on the campus. And I told the negative team, these two guys, not to argue that going fair trade would increase tuition because it's an irresponsible and unethical argument. Making the cafeteria go free trade had no bearing on tuition, the research indicated, and that argument would dominate the feeling of the people in the audience to the point where they'd ignore a lot of the more important issues we're thinking about. Well, sure enough, these two bozos went ahead and did that, and it just totally tanked the conversation afterwards because they didn't follow these rules. So these rules are important because it's like, if we're going to argue about something like immigration, we need to take off the table the idea that immigrants are horrible drug-dealing criminals or something like that. That might be your rule. Or we're not going to talk about asylum seekers. We're only going to talk about the people who are trying to get in who aren't seeking political asylum and who don't have a right to be here. Let's talk about that group only. Okay, that's how it's going to be defended and attacked. Or we're only going to talk about the Mexican border. It makes sense when if you're in a U.S. context. The Canadian border is not a controversial place for immigration. It was after 9/11 for a time because that's how the 9/11 hijackers and terrorists got into this country. It was through student visas at a Canadian border checkpoint. But it was our border guards doing the checking, not the Canadians' fault. But that's how they got in. So there was border security conversation on the Canadian side as well. And those things ramped up from 2001. Even today, it's a bit more strict than it was before 9/11, 2001. So that's what they're talking about there. And the conditions for who wins and how you win, how is an argument defeated or how not? If I can prove that without a salary cap, this team is better than this one. Okay, great. Now that gives you some guidelines about how this argument is going to proceed, right? That's what they mean. So what are the rules about how things can be attacked and defended? Okay, rule 6. The protagonist may always defend the standpoint that he or she adopts in the initial difference of opinion or in a sub-difference of opinion by performing a complex speech act of argumentation, which then counts as a provisional defense of this standpoint. Okay, great. So they use argumentation, which is propositional content and force, to defend their point. It's provisional because it hasn't been tested yet. The antagonist may always attack a standpoint by calling to question its propositional content. Do you have enough evidence? Do you have the right kind of evidence? Is your claim overblown? Are you using any fallacy? Or the force of argumentation. This is a good argument, well structured, but it's not strong enough for me to agree with you. Like, just because we save $1,000 a year is not a reason to remove rights from 1 million people. Something like that. That argument is obvious. It might be true. It might be statistically absolutely true, but it's not worth it in the case of what the cost would be of doing the policy. And the protagonist and the antagonist may not defend or attack standpoints in any other way. You can't say anything like you're stupid or, well, this whole topic is dumb or that kind of thing. There's restrictions about how things are supposed to be defended. So if you're having a debate about who should be president, who should we support, and the antagonist says, or the protagonist says, I think we shouldn't have a presidency. I don't think we should have a United States. That's a little bit out there, and it might not be considered to be an appropriate argument for that critical discussion based on the rules that were set up. So rule 6 is basically you have to use argumentation. You can't use anything else to defend yourself. Okay, we're almost halfway through. There's a lot of rules, you know. When you try to make argumentation rule-based, you're going to spend a long time on this. So how do we determine if argumentation is good? There's a procedure that you have to do, which they talk about. And that procedure would come externally and be validated in ways that you would draw upon and agree to with the people involved in the critical discussion. Rule 7. The protagonist has successfully defended a complex speech act of argumentation against an attack by the antagonist with regard to its propositional content if the application of the intersubjective identification procedure yields a positive result, or if the propositional content is in the second instance accepted by both parties as a result of a sub-discussion in which the protagonist has successfully defended a positive sub-standpoint with regard to this propositional content. Woo! Wow. Okay. So how do we know you've won? That's this rule. Rule 7. If the protagonist can answer the challenges, the point is handled. If the antagonist can't have the challenges answered, then their concerns are the better positions. This can also happen in subpoints of other arguments. There might be something revealed that then would either defend another point or reject another point that either hasn't been considered yet or might have been considered. So you might be on point 2, subpoint B, and that would show that point 1 had some serious problems with it and might have to go back and revisit that. So that's how argumentation works to determine who's winning these arguments. And this testing procedure section is kind of cool, where they say, look, there are all these different ways to test different arguments, and there are external ones from different philosophies and different practices. Go consult those and see if it's handled correctly. See if your arguments are being judged correctly. There's lots of ink spilled about this. Go find one that you and your friends like, or you and the people in your organization like, to handle your debates to determine if the arguments are good. They're very agnostic about that, although it has to be a complex speech act. It cannot be something simple like, well, it's a fact, or this is true. It has to be done in a way to where you say, here are the reasons why my opinion is the one you should accept, and here's the force of those reasons. That's what they want to be there. That's their requirement. Okay? So make sure you understand that. Okay, rule 8. Do I have to read all these long things? The protagonist has successfully defended a complex speech act of argumentation against an attack by the antagonist with regard to its force or justification or refutation of the application of the intersubjective inference procedure, and the application of the intersubjective testing procedure yields a positive result. Okay, so what this means is if we've tested it and it met both attacks and it meets the externalization procedure, intersubjective inference is everyone involved inside says, okay, this works. And then you do an explicitization procedure, which is more outside or more the standards. And it's what we call conclusively proven. Internal, external. Think about the kind of rigor between you and your friends thinking a paper is good and a professor thinking a paper is good. If it meets both, then it's conclusively a good paper. But let's say it meets the professor's standard, not your friends. Well, you sold out, right? You sold out to the man You wrote a paper as a tool of authority, and it sucks. You know it's not good, but you did it anyway, whatever. Or you wrote a really, really good paper, the professor marks it down. Well, they don't understand good writing and good art. Or they're a biased liberal SJW, and they don't accept conservative ideas. That's what it sounds like, right? So if it meets both, it's pretty conclusively good, right? So think about if it has internal and external validation, then it's good. Rule 9. What Rule 9 means is defending one standpoint doesn't mean that everything is okay or defended. When you have to do it, realize that not everything has to be attacked for something to be attacked. So a lot of people have the standard that you have to beat back all of my points or I've won. No, it can be that one point is so devastatingly destroyed by the antagonist that the entire opinion kind of crumbles. There's no reason to move forward on it, right? So think about the recent Supreme Court hearing of Amy Coney Barrett. And she talked about severability. This is a similar thing in law, severability, which means if a law is presented to a judge and the argument is that the law is unconstitutional, if the argument focuses on just one part of the law, it might not be enough. But if that part of the law is essential enough for the law's functioning and that part is unconstitutional, the entire law has to be dismissed, has to be overturned. And that was a big part of the debate about whether or not she should be confirmed as a Supreme Court justice. That's what they're talking about here, is that you don't have to beat everything in order to beat something. If you find one part of it that's essential to the entire structure of it and beat it, the whole thing goes down. But you don't have to beat every single part of it to beat it either. One or two is enough, but sometimes you have to do all of it. That's definitely on the table, but you don't have to do all of it all the time, right? You can beat it in other ways. So that's Rule 9. Rule 10. The antagonist retains throughout the entire discussion the right to call into question both the propositional content and the force of justification or refutation of every complex speech act of argumentation of the protagonist that the latter has not successfully defended. So this means the antagonist, this is kind of an interesting rule, because the antagonist is free to flow in strategy, but the protagonist is stuck defending everything. They don't have to defend things that aren't attacked, but the antagonist can attack anything they'd like, and they can proceed in a strategy of saying, there's not enough evidence there, that argument's not strong enough, that one's also not strong enough, that one doesn't have enough evidence. You see? So the antagonist has strategic options the protagonist doesn't. The protagonist cannot choose to say, well, I'm not going to defend that part of my opinion. They can't do that. But the antagonist can say, I'm not attacking that part, I'm just going after this part. And that's what Rule 10 is. The antagonist has a right to determine their own strategy and pursue the lines of arguments they want, as long as it's about propositional content and force. Kind of an interesting rule, right? Where people who are protagonists will say, yeah, but you haven't attacked the most important part. Bro, it's not your choice what the most important part is. It's the antagonist's choice under this set of rules. Okay, Rule 11. We're almost done. The protagonist retains throughout the entire discussion the right to defend both the propositional content and the force of justification or refutation of every complex speech act of argumentation that he or she has performed and not yet successfully defended against every attack by the antagonist. Okay, so the protagonist can defend anything anytime it gets attacked. That's what I'm reading there, right? As long as that line of argument has been closed off by some other way, they've either backed off of it or it was settled through some subpoint analysis earlier, the protagonist can address every argument that's made. They have a right to address everything the antagonist has said. So if they want to say, I want to go back to that thing you said earlier and talk about that, they have the right to do that. Rule 12, the protagonist retains throughout the entire discussion the right to retract the complex speech act of argumentation that he or she has performed and thereby remove the obligation to defend it. This is when they say, okay, forget that argument. Let me make another one. So if the opinion is shifting in the course of the debate, then the protagonist has the right to sort of edit it. They can say, okay, I don't mean that. And they can pull back from it. And then it's off the table for the discussion. Any part of the opinion that they offer. Okay. You're not obliged to defend something just because you said it. You can say, well, that's not what I meant. Let me pull that back. Let's focus on this part. Okay, Rule 13. 2 more to go. The protagonist and the antagonist may only once perform the same speech act or the same complex speech act with the same role in the discussion. The protagonist and the antagonist must perform speech acts or complex speech acts in turn. The protagonist and the antagonist may not perform more than one speech act or complex speech act at one time. Okay, don't talk over each other. Take the arguments one at a time. Don't mix it all up. And go in order. Keep an orderly discussion going where each point is handled and then another point is brought up. Don't jump around. Take care of each point and then move to the next one. Don't speak over each other and don't make multiple arguments at once. Makes sense to me, right? Rule 14. Rule 14 is long. I'm not going to read it. Here's what I think it means. The protagonist has the right to withdraw their position if it's successfully attacked. They're not committed to it just because you beat it. They can say, okay, you're right, withdrawing that. If the antagonist lost, they have to withdraw their position. They can't just keep beating a dead horse. So if the antagonist lost an argument, they pushed on a part of the proposition and they lost, then they can't really go for that argument anymore. They can't really talk about it. Waste of time. But if it's a draw at the end of the debate, both can keep their position. So maybe it wasn't successfully done. So this is kind of at the end. What happens at the end? So if there's more attacks on the initial standpoint that are convincing, then the antagonist can be said to have won. If the protagonist has defended it well and made good arguments and dealt with all the attacks, then maybe the opinion is stronger than people think. And if it's unconclusive, then it's unconclusive. It's a tie, then you could start over and do it a different way, or maybe change some of the wording or some of the rules. Always say what you're trying to say and phrase it optimally. Always talk in a way that clarifies. That's what this rights and obligation regarding usage declaratives. What am I trying to do? Usage declaratives are parts of speech where you're like, what am I trying to do? What's the purpose of this? What am I saying? So you want to optimally speak in a way to be understood, not to be tricky and not to win and not to make other people feel stupid, but to help people access why it is you feel the way you do. That's what that means, right? Kind of a nice rule. Rule 15. The discussants have the right at every stage of the discussion to request the other discussant to perform a usage declarative and to perform one themselves. So let me clarify what I mean. Everyone has a right to do that in the course of an argument. The discussant who is requested to perform a usage declarative by the other discussant is obliged to do so. What do you mean by that? Can you tell me what you mean by profit? What you mean by a healthy economy? I don't understand what you mean by that. This is important for argument. And that's why it's a rule. And that's why the last rule might be the most important one, which is don't be a jerk. Always try to clarify. Always try to be clear, and always try to make what it is that you want your meaning to be clear to the other side. You want to have a good debate. So maybe these rules would be good if you're sitting here. I doubt any candidates in the world would ever perform them. But that is the discussion of the Pragmadialectic essay for this one, this essay here that we were just talking about. I don't know why I went away from it. So I kind of want to show the title again. This essay, A Pragma-dialectical Procedure for Critical Discussion. That's basically how to understand it. Think about it as a set of rules that give us a result, a particular result from argument, that are based on making a highly philosophical, high-level conception of dialectics pragmatically accessible to people. That's what they're trying to do. What do you think of these rules? Talk on the Discord, leave a comment. Maybe you have a better set of rules that we could look at. But this is the Pragmadialectic Theory of argumentation through critical discussion as they're applied, practical, pragmatic way of having a good argument. I mean, maybe the Commission on Presidential Debates could get up and look at something once in a while and maybe find some inspiration here in order to actually do their jobs in the presidential debates for once. A little personal opinion there to end it. But let me know what you thought about this.